August 1944, northern Italy. The German High Command looked at their maps with quiet satisfaction. Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring commanded all forces south of the Alps. He studied the line his engineers had built across the narrowest part of the Italian peninsula. From the Ligurian Sea to the Adriatic, 300 miles of fortifications carved into mountains the ancient Romans themselves had feared to cross. The Gothic Line, 2,000 machine gun nests, 479 concrete bunkers, 30,000 metres of anti-tank ditches, 75,000 metres of wire, and behind it all the northern Apennines, peaks rising over 6,000 feet with slopes so steep that even mountain goats struggled. Kesselring told his staff he could hold this line with just 11 divisions. The terrain would do most of the work. Modern mechanised armies needed roads, tanks required bridges, artillery demanded stable firing positions. The British Eighth Army approaching from the south had none of these advantages. The mountains would force them onto predictable routes. German observation posts on every peak would direct fire onto any movement below. Supplies could not reach forward positions across such terrain. The British would break themselves against Italian stone, just as they had at Monte Cassino for 5 terrible months. What Kesselring did not know, what his intelligence officers had not told him, what seemed impossible to German doctrine, was that the British had already solved the mountain supply problem, not with new technology, not with American engineering, but with animals older than Rome itself. Tens of thousands of mules moving silently through darkness, carrying dismantled artillery pieces up slopes no vehicle could climb, supplied by muleteers who had learned their trade in Cyprus and on the northwest frontier of India. The Germans had bet their defensive strategy on terrain. The British would prove them catastrophically wrong with 4-legged pack animals that modern armies had supposedly left behind. This is the story of how British mules broke the unbreakable Gothic line. The German plan seemed flawless on paper. Field Marshal Kesselring had fought the British since North Africa in 1942. He respected Montgomery's methodical approach, his overwhelming artillery, his material superiority. But Kesselring also knew Montgomery's weakness. The British Eighth Army was a mechanised force. It relied on vehicles, on supply columns, on engineering to overcome obstacles. In the mountains of northern Italy, all those advantages disappeared. German engineers had worked through the summer of 1944, transforming the Apennines into Fortress Europe's final redoubt. General der Panzertruppe Friedrich von Zenger und Ettelin commanded 14th Panzer Corps, the formation that would hold the central sector. Von Zenger was an intellectual among Wehrmacht generals, a Rhodes scholar who spoke fluent English and had studied at Oxford before the First World War. He understood British military thinking perhaps better than any other German commander. Von Zenger looked at the terrain and saw salvation. Monte Altuzzo rose 5,700 feet. Monte Monticelli reached 5,200. Monte Grande, Monte Veruca, Monte Pratone, an endless succession of peaks, each commanding the valleys below, each turned into a strong point with interlocking fields of fire. The few roads through this wilderness were obvious kill zones. Demolitions would block them within hours of any British advance. After that, any attacking force would have to move cross-country, climbing slopes that exhausted even fit young soldiers while carrying ammunition and equipment on their backs. Von Zenger told his staff that each German division could hold a frontage 3 times wider than doctrine normally allowed. The mountains multiplied defensive strength. 3 soldiers with a machine gun on a ridge could stop a company. A single well-placed mortar team could interdict an entire valley. Artillery observation posts with clear sight lines meant every shell counted. The mathematics favoured the defence so heavily that von Zenger privately believed the Gothic line might hold until winter made operations impossible, buying Germany precious months to deploy new weapons, negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Anything to avoid total defeat. What von Zenger did not factor into his calculations was that the British had been preparing for this battle since Monte Cassino fell in May 1944. While German engineers built bunkers, British quartermasters were buying every mule they could find in southern Italy. While German intelligence tracked British vehicle movements, British muleteers were training animals and men for mountain warfare. And while German doctrine insisted modern armies needed roads, British planners were remembering lessons learned on the northwest frontier of India, where the Raj had fought mountain tribesmen for a century. The solution was ancient. Mules, not trucks, not jeeps. Four-legged pack animals that could climb 45-degree slopes, navigate narrow mountain trails in complete darkness, carry 200 pounds of supplies for hours without complaint, and most critically, move in near-perfect silence when properly trained. The British Army had maintained mule companies throughout the war, but Italy required expansion on a scale no one had anticipated. By August 1944, procurement officers had purchased approximately 15,000 mules from Italian farmers and breeders. Prices started at $80 per animal, but quickly rose to $250 as demand outstripped supply. Quality varied wildly. Some mules were young and strong, ideal for the mountains. Others were old or barely trained. In desperate situations, British officers bought mules knowing they might survive only a single trip to the front lines. The mathematics of mountain supply were brutal and unforgiving. A single British infantry regiment required 250 mules per day just to maintain operations. Each rifle company in mountain terrain needed approximately 40 mules. Battalion headquarters required several dozen more. Medical sections had dedicated animals for casualty evacuation and supplies. Multiply this across an entire division, and the numbers became staggering. The British 8th Army needed thousands of mules working every single night to keep forward positions supplied with ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. But quantity alone would not solve the problem. The mules had to move silently. German positions dominated every valley. Sound carried impossibly far in mountain air. A single bray could alert sentries a mile away, bringing artillery or mortar fire down on supply columns. Traditional mule handling accepted that animals made noise. They brayed to communicate with each other, especially during stressful situations like river crossings or steep climbs. For conventional warfare, this was merely an annoyance. In the mountains of Italy, it meant death. British veterinary officers found their solution in an experimental procedure developed for Chindit operations in Burma. Dr. A.J. Moffat had perfected a 3-minute surgical technique to remove a mule's vocal cords. The operation used local anaesthetic with the animal standing. Recovery took less than an hour. The mule could return to work the same day. The silence was absolute. A mule without vocal cords could not bray, could not whinny, could not make any sound louder than a quiet snuffle even under extreme stress. The procedure was not without cost. Mules used vocalizations to communicate with each other, especially during dangerous situations. A mule crossing a fast-flowing river would normally call out to others, both seeking and offering reassurance. Silent mules had to rely entirely on handlers and physical contact with other animals. But for mountain warfare in Italy, the tactical advantage outweighed these difficulties. German sentries might hear boots scuffing rock, might detect the occasional metallic clink of equipment, but they would never hear the distinctive bray that announced a mule train approaching. British muleteers took additional precautions. Metal carabiners were wrapped in cloth bandage material to muffle any sound. Water containers were filled completely to prevent sloshing. Night movements followed strict silence protocols with picket lines tightened to eliminate rope noise. Even the animals themselves were modified for operations. Light-coloured mules attracted attention, so procurement officers sprayed them with potassium permanganate solution, creating a brownish tint that lasted up to 2 months. In the mountains, even the colour of an animal could mean the difference between life and death. The men who led these silent mule trains came from across the Commonwealth. Cypriot muleteers formed entire companies, drawing on generations of experience with pack animals in the eastern Mediterranean. Indian Army units brought expertise honed on the northwest frontier, where mountains and mules were the only way to wage war against Pashtun tribesmen. British soldiers, many from agricultural backgrounds, learned the trade through intensive training courses that compressed months of experience into weeks of instruction. The training was demanding and specific. Mules had to be desensitized to gunfire and explosions. They learned to navigate rivers, bridges, rough terrain while carrying heavy loads. About 1/3 of candidate animals were eliminated during testing for gun shyness or temperament problems. Females were strongly preferred. Female mules had more stable temperaments under fire, were less aggressive toward each other in close quarters, and adapted better to the stress of constant shelling and small arms fire. The British selected Italian mules carefully. The animals averaged 14.2 hands, 4 feet 10 inches at the shoulder, and weighed between 1,000 and 1,200 pounds. Standard payloads were 180 to 200 pounds for extended campaigns. Good mules could carry 250 to 300 pounds. Experimental loads reached 400 pounds for short distances. The general rule was 1/3 of body weight, though experienced muleteers could sometimes push this limit with the right animal and proper load distribution. Each mule required 10 pounds of grain daily plus grazing time of at least 2 hours. Water was critical, especially in summer heat. A working mule needed several gallons per day. British quartermasters had to factor animal logistics into every operational plan. Moving an infantry brigade into the mountains meant not just supplying the men, but feeding and watering several hundred mules every single day. Pack equipment required constant maintenance. Saddles had to be adjusted to prevent sores. Loads had to be balanced perfectly or the animal would quickly develop injuries. Hooves needed regular attention. But the payoff was transformational. A mule could go where no vehicle could follow. Steep mountain trails that exhausted soldiers became routine routes for trained animals. Narrow paths along cliff edges, boulder fields, river crossings at night. Terrain that stopped tanks and trucks was merely another day's work for a good mule and an experienced handler. The British 8th Army could maintain forward positions that German planning had assumed were impossible to supply. Observation posts on peaks over 5,000 feet received regular deliveries. Rifle companies dug in on ridge lines got ammunition resupply every night. Artillery batteries on mountainsides fired hundreds of shells, all carried up by mules, and unlike trucks, mules left almost no trace. A vehicle, convoy raised dust visible for miles, created noise audible across valleys, and was limited to established roads that German artillery had pre-registered. A mule train moving at night across mountain trails was nearly undetectable. Even thermal observation could not easily distinguish animals from the natural environment. British forces could reinforce positions, rotate tired units, position artillery in unexpected locations, all without German intelligence detecting the movement. The Gothic Line offensive began on August 25, 1944. British 8th Army, now commanded by Lieutenant General Sir Oliver Leese, attacked along the Adriatic coast. This was the deception. Montgomery, who had planned the operation before being recalled to command for Normandy, wanted the Germans looking east while the real blow fell in the mountains. The British 5th Corps assaulted toward the Adriatic coastal plain with strong armoured formations. The flat terrain suited British tanks and artillery. German forces responded exactly as planned, reinforcing their eastern positions. Kesselring moved reserves toward the coast, believing the main attack was developing there. For 10 days the deception held. German intelligence reported heavy fighting along the coast, British casualties mounted. It looked like the expected grinding attritional assault that Montgomery favoured. Then on September 10th, the British 13th Corps struck into the mountains. The British 78th Infantry Division, known as the Battle Axe Division, led the assault. This formation had earned Montgomery's personal praise as the best mountain warfare division in the British 8th Army. They had fought through Tunisia, Sicily, and up the Italian peninsula, learning mountain tactics through brutal experience. Their commander, Major General Charles Cately, understood that mountains favoured the defence, but only if the attacker accepted conventional limitations. The 78th Division did not accept those limitations. Their battalions advanced with mule trains following immediately behind the assault companies. As soon as a position was secured, muleteers brought up ammunition, supplies, medical equipment. Forward companies never ran short. When German counterattacks came, British riflemen had full ammunition pouches. When casualties occurred, medical supplies and stretchers were already positioned. The tactical effect was dramatic. British units could sustain offensive operations where German planning assumed they would run out of supplies within hours. But the real transformation came with British artillery. Mountain artillery presented unique challenges. Standard British 25-pounder guns weighed over 3,000 pounds, far too heavy for mule transport. But the British had also deployed 3.7-inch mountain howitzers specifically designed for pack animal operations. These weapons could be completely dismantled into 6 loads, each weighing less than 250 pounds. 6 mules carried 1 complete howitzer, ammunition, and firing equipment. The tactical implications were revolutionary. British gunners positioned artillery on mountain ridges where German doctrine said artillery could not exist. Observation posts on peaks directed fire from batteries located on adjacent mountains. Approaches that German planning assumed were safe from artillery suddenly came under accurate fire. German troops moving through valleys found themselves under bombardment from positions they could not see, located on terrain they believed impassable for guns. The British 8th Indian Division joined the mountain assault in September. This formation brought expertise unmatched in mountain warfare. Indian Army units had fought on the northwest frontier for generations. Gurkha battalions from Nepal, Punjabi companies from the Punjab, Rajputana riflemen, all understood mountain fighting instinctively. They moved through terrain that exhausted European soldiers. They climbed at night without hesitation. They accepted the physical demands of mountain warfare as normal rather than exceptional. The 8th Indian Division had arrived in Italy in September 1943 and fought continuously for 19 months. At Monte Cassino, they had crossed the Gari River on May 11, 1944, in an assault that proved critical to finally breaking that terrible position. The division won nearly 600 awards, including 4 Victoria Crosses during the Italian campaign. They suffered over 2,000 casualties over those 19 months. Their motto was simple and appropriate: one more river, one more mountain, one more position to take. Now they brought that experience to the Gothic line. Indian Army muleteers managed pack trains with casual efficiency that amazed British observers. A Punjabi havildar could load 4 mules in the time it took a British corporal to load 2. Gurkha riflemen thought nothing of climbing 5,000 feet carrying full equipment, then fighting a battle at the summit, then climbing back down to resupply. British officers leading Indian Army units quickly learned to trust their men's mountain sense. A Gurkha jemadar who said a route was possible was usually right. A Punjabi subadar who recommended an approach generally chose correctly. And behind every advancing Indian battalion, mule trains delivered the supplies that made sustained operations possible. Each Indian division had its own mule companies, often using animals purchased locally and trained by men who had worked with pack animals their entire lives. The efficiency was remarkable. Where British units required careful planning and detailed orders to organise a mule lift, Indian Army companies simply did the work. Muleteers understood their animals, knew the routes, anticipated problems, and solved them without consulting officers. The German defenders fought with their customary skill and courage. Fallschirmjäger, paratroops, held many positions. These were elite troops, experienced from Cretan Russia, experts at defensive warfare. They had prepared positions for weeks. Every approach was registered for mortar fire. Machine guns had interlocking fields of fire. Snipers waited at key points. German artillery observers on the peaks could direct fire across entire valleys. But German planning had not accounted for the British supply capability. When a British company assaulted a German position and was repulsed with heavy casualties, German doctrine expected the attack to fail. The attacking unit would be exhausted, low on ammunition, unable to renew the assault for hours or days. Instead, British units reorganised, received ammunition resupply via mule train, brought up reinforcements and attacked again within hours, sometimes before the Germans had finished evacuating their own wounded. The psychological effect on German defenders was significant. They inflicted casualties, they stopped attacks, then British forces came again, fully supplied, fully equipped, as if the previous assault had never happened. Fallschirmjäger, who had fought in Russia, recognised this pattern. Soviet human wave attacks had the same relentless quality. But these were not conscripts being driven forward by political officers. These were professional British and Commonwealth soldiers, tactically competent, well-led, adequately supplied even in impossible terrain. Montegrand fell to the British 78th Division in mid-September, after days of intense fighting. The Battle-Axe Division lost heavily, but they took the peak. German counterattacks, fierce and determined, were beaten back. British artillery, positioned on adjacent ridges courtesy of mule transport, provided fire support that broke up German forming-up areas. Within 24 hours of securing the position, British engineers had mule trails expanded sufficiently to bring up heavier equipment. The fighting became a terrible arithmetic. German positions were strong but limited in depth. Once British forces broke through the initial fortifications, the defenders had few prepared fallback positions. The mountains that made the Gothic line so formidable as a barrier worked against tactical flexibility once that barrier was pierced. German units could not easily move laterally to reinforce threatened sectors. The roads were few and predictable. British artillery targeted every route. Meanwhile, British mule trains continued operating every night. Muleteers learned the routes through repetition. Experienced handlers could navigate mountain trails in complete darkness, guiding their animals by touch and memory. The Germans tried to interdict these supply lines with artillery and mortars, but targets were fleeting and difficult to hit. A stationary truck convoy on a road was easy to destroy. A mule train moving across open mountain terrain at night, dispersed, silent, and mobile, presented no worthwhile target. British casualties were significant. Mountain warfare extracted a terrible price. The 78th Division alone suffered thousands of casualties pushing through the Gothic Line positions. The 8th Indian Division lost hundreds of men. Gurkha companies were reduced to half strength, then reinforced, then reduced again. The Royal Artillery forward observers who directed fire from exposed positions died at appalling rates. Muleteers leading supply columns through contested terrain took casualties from artillery, mortars, and small arms fire. But the offensive continued. The British could replace losses. Mules kept forward units supplied. Artillery ammunition never ran short. Medical evacuation using mules as ambulances meant wounded men reached aid stations within hours rather than being left on the battlefield. The system worked. It was unglamorous, physically demanding, dependent on animals and the men who handled them, but it worked where modern mechanized logistics failed. By late September, the Gothic Line had been decisively breached in multiple sectors. German forces were falling back toward the Po Valley. Kesselring's 11 divisions were no longer enough. The terrain advantage had not compensated for British determination and logistical innovation. Von Senger, watching his carefully prepared positions abandoned one after another, recognized what had happened. The British had solved the mountain supply problem. They had sustained offensive operations where German planning assumed supply difficulties would halt any attack. In his post-war memoir, Neither Fear Nor Hope, von Senger wrote with grudging respect about the Allied capabilities in Italy. He praised French colonial troops for their mountain skills. He acknowledged British artillery superiority. He noted the overwhelming material advantage his forces faced, but he did not specifically discuss mules or pack animal logistics as a tactical surprise. For German commanders, the shock was not the method, but the result. British forces had maintained operational tempo in terrain that should have stopped them. How they achieved this was less important than the fact that they had. The numbers tell the story more precisely than any testimony. British and Commonwealth forces procured 15,000 mules for the Italian campaign, with 11,000 actually issued to formations. Each infantry regiment required 250 mules daily. Multiply this across multiple divisions operating simultaneously and the scale becomes clear. Thousands of animals, tens of thousands of loads, millions of pounds of supplies, all moved across mountains where vehicles could not go. The Gothic Line had been broken by late October 1944, after 2 months of sustained fighting. British and Commonwealth forces had broken through positions German engineers believed could hold for 6 months or longer. The cost was heavy. The 8th Army suffered. Over 14,000 casualties. Indian divisions were badly worn down. British infantry battalions required extensive reinforcement, but the line was broken. The road to the Po Valley lay open, and it was broken by mules. Silent, patient, hard-working animals that modern military doctrine had dismissed as obsolete. German planning had bet everything on terrain. Mountains would stop mechanized armies, supply difficulties would halt offensives, natural barriers would multiply defensive strength. The British proved every assumption wrong by reverting to methods the Roman legions would have recognized. Pack animals, mountain trails, patient logistics, and men brave enough to lead supply columns through contested terrain night after night after night. The Cypriot muleteers deserve particular mention. 12,288 Cypriots served during the war, many as muleteers in Italy. They came from small villages on an island where every family kept donkeys and mules. They understood animals instinctively. British officers quickly learned that Cypriot handlers could manage the most difficult mules, could navigate impossible terrain, and would do so under fire without hesitation. Captain Joachim Constantinou Scarperes, 25 years old from Dora village in Cyprus, led mule trains through Death Valley at Monte Cassino in February 1944. This was before the Gothic Line, but the same principles applied. German artillery and machine guns had Death Valley registered perfectly. Crossing those 7 miles required moving at night, dispersed quickly. Scarparis made the journey repeatedly. Some of his mules died, killed by shell fragments or machine gun fire. Men died too. But the supplies got through. Indian soldiers holding positions on the mountainside received ammunition, food, and water, because Cypriot muleteers were willing to lead animals through German fire. The technical achievement should not be understated. Removing a mule's vocal cords without modern veterinary facilities, in a war zone, at scale, was remarkable. Dr. Moffat's 3-minute procedure was performed on thousands of animals. The success rate was high enough that the technique became standard practice. British veterinary officers, who numbered over 500 officers and nearly 4,000 other ranks by war's end, maintained these silent mule companies across months of continuous operations. Training was equally impressive. A mule had to learn to ignore gunfire, explosions, the smell of blood and death. It had to navigate by night across terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. It had to climb slopes that tested human endurance while carrying 200 pounds. It had to do this while essentially mute, unable to communicate with other animals normally. That British veterinary officers and muleteers achieved this at scale, under combat conditions, with locally procured animals of varying quality, represents a significant achievement in animal training and logistics. The German defenders were professional soldiers. They understood mountain warfare. Their defensive positions were well constructed. Their artillery was accurately directed. Their infantry fought with courage and skill. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They assumed modern mechanized armies required roads and vehicles. They assumed mountain supply chains would collapse under the demands of sustained operations. They assumed the British, with their focus on artillery and tanks and engineering, could not adapt to terrain where none of those advantages applied. The British proved them wrong by returning to fundamentals. Mules had carried supplies for armies since ancient times. The British Northwest Frontier Constabulary had used them for a century. Chinese armies moved entire divisions by mule. Spanish guerrillas in the Peninsular War had sustained operations with pack animals. British military doctrine had not forgotten these lessons, just temporarily sidelined them in favour of mechanization. Italy forced a return to basics, and the British had the institutional flexibility to make that adaptation. Procurement officers bought thousands of mules from Italian farmers. Veterinary officers developed the surgical technique for silence. Muleteers learned their trade through shortened but intensive training. Commanders planned operations around mule logistics rather than trying to force vehicle doctrine onto mountain terrain. The result was an army that could sustain offensive operations where modern military theory said it should fail. The Gothic Line was not the only place where mules made the difference, but it was the most dramatic example. At Monte Cassino, mules had sustained the siege. In the Apennines north of Rome, they supplied advancing units. But at the Gothic Line, mule logistics made the impossible possible. British forces broke through fortifications in terrain that should have stopped them cold. They did so because patient animals, surgically silenced, led by brave men, moved supplies through mountain darkness every single night of the campaign. The German commanders who survived the war rarely discussed this aspect of their defeat. Memoirs focused on grand strategy, Hitler's interference, material imbalances between Germany and the Allies. The tactical minutiae of how British forces sustained mountain operations did not seem important compared to these larger themes. But for the soldiers fighting in the mountains, for the muleteers leading supply columns, for the Indian Army battalions holding positions that German planning said could not be supplied, the mules made all the difference. After the Gothic Line fell, British forces continued north. The Po Valley campaign in 1945 used mules less extensively. The terrain was flatter, roads were more numerous, vehicle logistics worked again. But the campaign that broke through the mountains, that proved German, defensive assumptions wrong, that opened northern Italy to Allied advance, that campaign depended absolutely on silent mules carrying supplies across terrain modern armies thought impassable. The British Army decommissioned most mule units after the war. Mechanization resumed. Military doctrine moved toward helicopters and vehicles for supply. The techniques learned in Italy were archived, studied, occasionally remembered when new mountain campaigns in Afghanistan or other difficult terrain required pack animals again. But for a critical period in 1944 in the mountains of northern Italy, mules were not obsolete. They were essential. German feldmarschals and generals had bet on terrain. They built fortifications in mountains, confident that modern armies needed roads. They positioned their forces to defend predictable routes, knowing mechanized forces had no choice but to use them. They calculated that British logistics would fail trying to supply operations in such terrain. Every calculation was reasonable, every assumption was based on modern military doctrine, and every prediction proved wrong because the British adapted while the Germans remained prisoners of their own doctrine. The Gothic line fell not to tanks or aircraft or overwhelming artillery alone, though all those played their part. It fell because thousands of mules working silently through mountain nights carried the supplies that sustained the offensive. It fell because muleteers from Cyprus, Britain and India were willing to lead animals through German fire. It fell because British veterinary officers developed surgical techniques that made mules silent. It fell because British commanders were flexible enough to plan operations around pack animal logistics, rather than insisting on vehicle doctrine where it did not apply. And it fell because the British understood something fundamental about warfare that the Germans forgot. Technology amplifies capability, but does not replace basics. Armies need supplies regardless of how modern their equipment is. Mountains do not care about doctrine. Terrain favours whoever adapts to its demands rather than demanding it adapt to their preferences. The Germans built mountain fortresses. They positioned elite troops in prepared positions. They registered every approach for artillery fire. They planned a defence that should have held for months. It held for weeks. And it fell to an army supplied by animals the Romans would have recognised, adapted with a surgical technique that removed their voices, led by men brave enough to walk through darkness under enemy guns, night after night after night, until the impossible became routine and the unbreakable line broke. 7,000 words about mules seems excessive until you understand what they achieved. They sustained operations where modern logistics failed. They moved silently where vehicles announced their presence. They climbed terrain that stopped tanks. They carried artillery to positions German doctrine said artillery could not reach. They evacuated wounded from battlefields where no ambulance could go. They did this for months, in all weathers, under fire, with patient endurance that broke German defensive mathematics. The British Eighth Army broke the Gothic line with infantry courage, artillery excellence, tactical competence and mule logistics. The first three receive attention in histories. The fourth deserves equal recognition. Because without those silent animals carrying supplies through mountain darkness, the offensive would have failed. German assumptions would have proven correct. The Gothic line might have held until winter, and the British would have learned again what every army eventually learns. Logistics determines what tactics can achieve, and in mountains, until helicopters became common decades later, logistics meant mules. The German fortress held for 2 months instead of 6. Then it fell. And when historians ask how British forces sustained operations in such terrain, the answer is unglamorous but accurate. Mules, thousands of them, silent, patient, and utterly essential.